Morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Today is a very happy day for Elcano Institute, Instituto Elcano. Before giving the floor to our chairman, José Ruiz, I wanted to give you a warm welcome. And today is a happy day because this is the first public event that we've organized ever since the pandemic started, and we're happy to be able to do it in relationship with NATO because of reasons that we are going to see over the next hour. Will take most of our work from here till the NATO summit takes place next year. So we give the floor to our chairman right now. Good morning. Good morning, Charles. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thanks to all the participants for being here. Thanks to the Vice Chairman of Elcano Royal Institute, who is joining us in this first public event, as Charles said, and this is something that makes us really happy, especially because we're going to be tackling a topic that, as you will probably see, we're going to be working on not only next year, but for many years to come, and we're going to work hard on this. And the reason for that is very simple. The NATO summit that will take place in Madrid next year is an event that is going to be especially relevant for the history of our institution, because we are expecting the approval of a new strategic concept. A new strategic concept, this is the political document that is going to be the most important one for the Atlantic Alliance. During the period after the war, strategic concepts normally had a duration of approximately 10 years, in such a way that the concept that will come out of Madrid summit will have an impact in the life of the institution, and therefore it will have an impact in the defense and the security of the allied countries for many years. Also, the strategic concept coming out of Madrid is going to be very relevant because it has to prepare the institution for an international environment that it is substantially different to the one that we've seen in the past decades. And because we're seeing a change in the paradigm, in the function, and in the perspectives of NATO, what happens in Madrid is going to be extremely relevant. I know that we've used the term relevant very much, but we know that this is going to be historical, and it's going to be historical for the Spanish policy. It's a great success to have this meeting taking place here in Madrid. NATO has been the cornerstone of safety and security in the continent and also in Spain. NATO, and this is especially important for our country, is a tool that it is fantastic, very efficient, and extremely important when considering, when achieving stability with our south neighbors, especially in the northern Africa and in the Sahel region. So highlighting this is going to be one of the most important priorities of Spain within the summit. But apart from looking at our neighboring countries, our southern neighboring countries, Spain also has an opportunity to highlight the strength of their Atlantic links and transatlantic link in a very broad sense. This transatlantic link is not only in the essence of our country, in Spanish DNA, but it is also important for the DNA of the Royal Institute Elcano, that, as you well know, has the name of the person who went around the world for the first time and started this type of adventure. So this summit gives us an opportunity to show our commitment with the institution, NATO, with the transatlantic links, and with our transatlantic bonds that I'm sure that we will all be able to take advantage of. Also, NATO and this summit gives us, as Spaniards, more possibilities, a new dimension. As you well know, next year we'll celebrate 40 years of the access of Spain to the NATO. And many things have happened in the last 40 years. The Spanish defense dramatically changed with our accessing to NATO, and Spain contributes to international security and contributes to the alliance. It's absolutely necessary to communicate the value of our belonging to this institution during the last 40 years, to get out of the expert opinions and to reach society so that we can explain to whole society how much has contributed to Spain our belonging to the NATO. And Elcano is going to be making important efforts in order to raise our awareness. We'll have no reluctances in that sense, because we believe that this is very important for our country, for NATO, and above all for Spanish society. And we need to reach the youngsters. We need to reach the academia and universities and other centers that probably were not aware of what was happening and will be surprised about the positive results of our integration of this multilateral body, on this multilateral organization. This is something that you will learn over the next debate. I don't want to take any longer because the protagonists today are our NATO representatives, our researchers, our guests, that I believe will be able to express what I have just mentioned, what I have just tried to summarize, and they will do it much better than I can do. So thank you very much for being today with us. Thank you very much for participating in this face-to-face re-inaugurational event, and especially talking about this aspect that it is at the core of our research agenda. Thank you. Charles, you have now the floor. Thank you very much, Chairman. If you'll allow me, I will switch to English in order to provide a better service to our guests.
Ambassador, it's wonderful to have you with us. I'm going to very briefly introduce our speakers. We're very honored and fortunate to have with us today Ambassador Baiba Braže, who is the Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy at NATO. She has come to Madrid to initiate, really, this very long process which will lead to what I'm sure will be an extremely successful Madrid summit in June. I will then ask Luis, I will ask Claudia Mayo to speak. Claudia is a senior analyst at the Stiftung Wissenschaft and Politik in Berlin and at the head of international security there. She has been traveling a lot in the last few days, so I'm very grateful, Claudia, that you could find time for us. It's wonderful to have you with us. I will then turn to Luis Simón, who, as you all know, is a senior analyst at Elcano and the director of our Brussels office, so he's going to have a very busy year as well. And finally, last but by no means least, we have our dear friend Federico Torres, who is a well-known Spanish diplomat and currently Director General for Foreign and Security Policy at the Spanish Foreign Ministry here in Madrid. So without further ado, Ambassador, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, and I will stay in my seat and continue this very interesting discussion. And I would like to thank Elcano Institute for organizing this very first event. We will have a set of public outreach events in Spain, but also in other allied countries, because we want to hear from our publics. We want to hear from our researchers in the alliance, from the private sector, from youth audiences, from a variety of sources. What do they think NATO's role in the future of their security and defense should be? This is a special time. The 40 years is not only of Spain's accession, but actually it's already this December when 40 years since the decision was made to accede takes place. And in connection with that, I would like to recall that King Felipe, when he visited the North Atlantic Council in 2018 and spoke to the North Atlantic Council, said that for Spain it has been crucially important to be a member of NATO. And why Spain joined NATO and the sort of values that underpin this greatest political military alliance is the same values that were the basis of the fathers of Foundation Forum for the US, or the basis for the Constitution of Cadiz, which is the individual liberties, the rule of law, the equality, and the safety and security of our people. So this is who we are as currently 30 collectively connected allies who want to build and continue building our alliance that is fit for the future, and through this collective expression of will to draft a new strategic concept which will then lead us, which will chart the way for the adaptation of NATO for the future. Also, I would like to really thank Spain, both the political establishment, military establishment, your civil society, your researchers, all pillars of your society and media for their contribution to NATO. You have made NATO stronger and NATO has made Spain stronger, so it's a win-win situation. When we look today how Spain contributes to international security, I have just jotted down a couple of things here. We have Spain's strong contribution to training mission in Iraq. We have Spain's very strong largest contingent in the NATO's forward presence on northeastern border. I visited your troops myself. Fantastic, fantastic representatives of your military and exemplary NATO military representatives. Spain polices the whole of air policing the NATO's airspace, and you recently saw what it means in practice when your prime minister, president of the government, visited the air policing mission in the Baltics. You provide also Patriot batteries to Turkey and make sure that also the threats from the south, from Syria, are well prevented there. We recently saw the capabilities that your Air Force and the whole military has in helping to evacuate civilians and Afghans that are related to NATO and to Spain from Afghanistan and taking care of them. So there is a whole set of Spanish capabilities and commitments that contribute to the whole Euro-Atlantic security. Also, your role in giving your wisdom and providing your engagement and thinking on wider challenges that we have, be it on China, be it on the challenges we face in the south. So, for example, Spain has taken an active role as NATO's contact point embassy in Mauritania, doing the whole set of public diplomacy engagement there, again, promoting our collective interest. When we look again at the summit, I think it's important to also recall the decisions that our allies made, 30 allies, in connection with so-called 2030 agenda this summer in Brussels summit. So it was about boosting resilience, it was about cyber defenses, it was about sharpening our technological edge, addressing security impact of climate change, but also making sure that the alliance, as the alliance of 30 allies, is fit for the future. So from one hand, we do recognize that we are at a pivotal moment of our shared security. There is a strategic competition ongoing. We all know that it's a more sort of dangerous world, but also more competitive world. And it's not only Russia that is constantly aggressive abroad, constantly employing the whole spectrum of hybrid means to undermine the whole set of democracies within the Euro-Atlantic, but also outside the field. But it's also China that we don't see as adversary as NATO, but in the same time, we clearly recognize that its economic and political might is used not only to control its own people, but also to coerce certain countries into certain types of behaviors, whether it's over global supply chains, whether it's investment in critical infrastructure, unfair competition, suppression of human rights, but also lack of transparency on their military capabilities. And that for us as responsible political military alliance, we would really like this engagement from the Chinese side to explain, to be transparent and open about its intentions and about what it's doing. Then, indeed, when we look at the challenges and threats for the people, for the alliance, for our societies, there is no one answer. It cannot be just a kinetic answer, purely traditional answer by us. The threats have become, not only the kinetic threats have not disappeared, the old usual threats have not disappeared, but the new ones are there. And again, we can call them hybrid, but essentially those are threats that don't recognize the borders. Are there cyber attacks? Are these hostile information attacks? Are these using mercenaries, using energy tools? There's a whole set of different means that we have to recognize exist. So the answer that we have chosen as a 30 is to increase resilience of our societies, and that's a whole society resilience, which means not only the governments and governments' critical infrastructure, communication systems, ability to recover from crisis or prevent crisis, but also private sector. And very often, especially in terms of cyber or hostile information attacks, it will be the private sector that will react first. So it's important that we all as governments work together with the private sector for that. But also civil societies, media, academia, researchers, because you are those credible sources that can translate these political decisions to the core of the society. And you have a very, very important role to play as Elcano, but as each one of you, including media. These credible sources in today's times when data is transmitted, perceived, and dealt with at a very ground level by individuals and by smaller society groups, we all have a role to play in building that resilience against these threats. Also, I would like to mention the important roles that we attach to the partnerships. And the partnerships, not only collectively, for example, NATO-EU partnership, where we strive for, again, addressing these threats and challenges with partners that we have, but also with partners in Latin America, partners in Asia-Pacific, and partners all around the globe who have the same values and who have the same sort of aim to build our future, our prosperity and security in a democratic way. It's simple as that. So we will not give up in our cooperation with all the countries who are interested in partnerships, and we also expect that in the Madrid summit that will be one of the most important engagements that we will have. So to summarize, Madrid summit and the new strategic concepts that we will be launching, we will collectively try to embody all these various challenges and the answers to these challenges, but also threats, and to adjust our great alliance for the future, adapt the decisions, and make sure that this unique political military alliance that we have, that has made all of us stronger, is fit for the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for helping us frame our conversation this morning. Claudia, I'm going to turn to you now. I know we had asked you to address a rather broad array of issues, so please feel free to place the emphasis wherever you see fit. We were talking earlier about the impact of political events in Germany. Claudia was saying that there will be a new chancellor, hopefully by the 6th of December this year, which will inject some certainty in what is otherwise a rather uncertain world. We've also asked you to talk a little about the EU-NATO relationship, which I think is experiencing, again, a little bit more uncertainty than was the case in the past, partly because of the salience of this concept that's on many people's minds nowadays, namely strategic autonomy, which is one of the big buzzwords in our ongoing conversations. And finally, perhaps something about the post-Afghanistan climate. how do you think events in Afghanistan, developments in Afghanistan will impact this ongoing debate about the future of NATO? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I feel like I will be here until tomorrow if I touch upon all those topics. I will try my best. But first, let me underline again that I'm really delighted to be here. And I have to say, after all those COVID non-traveling, it really makes a difference where debate takes place. So whether we are in Brussels, in Berlin, or in Madrid, it really is a difference. So I'm really delighted to be here and have this conversation here in Madrid and not somewhere else. And I also tend to think maybe that's becoming, because I come from Germany where NATO is a difficult sell, I think that those debates are really, really important to outreach and to explain, from my opinion, why NATO matters, what it's going to do and why it's important. So I'm really delighted to be in Madrid today. I try to take all your points somehow. I'm not going to touch upon all, but I try to organize it in 3 very brief points. The first is the purpose of a concept. What should it help us to do? The points that Baiba touched upon, but what is the kind of underlying idea? The second on priorities, EU, NATO, getting the right balances of tasks in the new concept. And the last and third point about Germany, or what a key ally who's looking for a new government is likely to do. Let me start with the first one, the purpose of a strategic concept. Baiba outlined perfectly what should be in, what we need to address and all that. And particularly after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine, it was pretty clear that new political guidance was needed. Just as a very, very brief reminder, the 2010 concept mentions Russia in terms of partnership, doesn't mention China, doesn't mention new technologies. So many things that were just mentioned in the previous statement are simply not in. So it's clear it's pretty old. The interesting bit, I tend to think, is that since 2014, NATO obviously has not been sleeping, but since 2014, NATO has been adapting in the military realm in pretty big steps. So there was a change of the command structure, of the processes, of the force structure, of the defense planning, and NATO very actively since 2014 changed its military posture in order to better protect its allies, particularly from threats from Russia, which we thought were a bit old style, but actually we're back with the annexation of Crimea, the engagement in Ukraine, but also Russia's very active policies in Syria and the Black Sea and many other areas. So this gives us a little bit funnier situation that in military terms, NATO has been making big steps forwards since 2014 with a new military strategy, with a deterrence and defense concept, and many other things. But the political guidance, the narrative, why we're doing all that, was a bit lagging behind. So it's really good to have that political concept coming up with offering to offer us guidance, assessment, and a narrative. And if I would try to break it down in 4 main points, what the concept should do or what the purpose of the concept is, I would suggest the following. The first, a good concept would give all allies strategic direction, prioritize threats, prioritize the geographic focus maybe a little bit. And this is even more important given that we have not this one nice, fancy, unifying threat which we used to have in the past in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But we have a high number of threats from China to Russia to instability in the south. So there's a lot of things going on, and we need to offer strategic direction, priorities, and a focus. The second is to codify piecemeal decisions of previous summits and declarations. We have been talking a lot about China, but there is not this one point on China. So we need to kind of codify what has been done over the last years. So we need first strategic direction, second codify piecemeal decisions, third public diplomacy to explain the purpose of the alliance. It actually means explaining why NATO serves the citizens, why it's worth the effort. What we have, at least in my country, in Germany in the moment, is we have an increased defense spending, we talk more about defense, but at the same time, our public feels less secure. How do we close that gap? And this is where concept really helps if it offers a strategic narrative and explains the purpose, why NATO is our life insurance, to put it in a very simple sentences. The fourth point is the process. There are big differences between the Baltic countries and Spain, between Germany and Italy, between France and Denmark. We are all allies. And if we engage in the debates about a strategic concept, we are all forced to listen to each other. And that's a big step forward, to listen what worries our allies. What are they concerned about? And that in the end, if all things go well, facilitates compromises and understanding. And this process is as important as the final product. And if all those four functions, strategic direction, codify piecemeal decisions, public diplomacy, and the process, if all those go well together, that helps to create the cohesion and the unity on the political dimension that NATO needs. Because there's no credible defense and deterrence in the military realm if we don't have that political unity and cohesion, with all allies really teaming up and convincingly promising, not only in the inside, but to the outside world, we 30 allies, we are really standing up to each other. So this process really, really is important. Second point, how to make the concept a success. Those 4 steps, obviously. It's, I think, to a large extent about priorities and cooperation. Priorities, what does it mean? I think there's a broad agreement what should be in the new concept. I'm a bit cheeky here. Russia, China, terrorism, new technologies, nuclear deterrence, space resilience, green military, climate change, maritime dimension. I think everybody in this room could probably add something to the list. But there's an obviously danger of having too many things on the list and having not a priority. And if we want to really have that strategic guidance, that narrative that drives us forward and keeps us together, we need priorities. So if I can make a suggestion, I think while NATO should keep the 3 core tasks, collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security, and I think it's largely agreement on that, I think the priority is deterrence and defense in Europe. And the objective should be the right posture of nuclear, conventional, cyber, and space elements that allow for an active posture in Europe and that does not cede any space to any enemies. The biggest risk, probably, is a crisis in the neighborhood that develops into a conflict. And hence, the need to rebuild deterrence and to rebuild that deeply needed political unity. And that should be, I tend to think, the core priorities. And I was also asked to say something about the dialogue with Russia. Deterrence doesn't exclude dialogue, quite the opposite. The 2-track approach that NATO has been following over the last years, since the annexation of Crimea, is exactly that. It's deterrence and dialogue, going back to the 1967 approach of Hamel, who said we need dialogue in order to have stability, and maybe go back, improve relationships, but we need to have deterrence to protect our allies. The important thing about that 2-step approach is the sequence. Dialogue can only happen if it builds upon credible deterrence. And we have to keep that sequence in mind. So we have to rebuild our deterrence and defense in Europe in order to be able to engage in a meaningful dialogue with Russia. So obviously continue this double-track approach. Cooperation, there are some tasks, cooperation is extremely important, but there are some tasks where NATO should clearly be in the lead, like deterrence and defense. And there are other tasks where maybe other organizations are better placed to lead, and NATO has an extremely important role, but rather a supportive one. And I tend to think, just give you 2 examples, resilience, the bounce back ability, the way to be able to cope with problems is something NATO has to learn, but most of the tools for that lie with the member states and with the European Union. So the key challenge here is a meaningful cooperation with the European Union. The same is with new technologies that NATO obviously has to address as a defense alliance. And it has to stimulate innovation, as it decided to do with launching an innovation fund and supporting defense innovation. But this is something where also other actors like the European Union is already underway. So here again comes in the challenge of cooperating with the partners in a meaningful way. Europeans have the luxury of having 2 organizations to cope with security, the European Union and NATO. And we have in the moment a unique chance to improve the coordination because both organizations are engaged in strategic thinking. The European Union is working on its strategic compass, which is a kind of defense white paper, and NATO is working on a strategic concept. Already the wording is pretty close. So we have in parallel 2 processes running. That's the best possibility we have to actually coordinate strategic thinking and somehow better link European defense. So the positive fallout, for example, of coordinated strategic processes would be a new joint planning cycle in EU and NATO. European defense in a meaningful way means to link EU and NATO because both deliver for European defense. So not a beauty contest, so cooperation. Last point, where's Germany heading? To be honest, I don't know. The negotiations started now, they start today. They will have a first basic paper in the middle of November. They will end the coalition treaty at the end of November, and we will have a chancellor if all things go well in early December, which is good news, because the last time we had coalition negotiations, they took until March. So that's already the good news. The second good news is that we have a first basic exploratory paper, as we call it in German, which outlines some basic positions and some basic compromises. And if I look at that paper, there's good news in. There's, for example, the recognition of NATO's role. It says, the transatlantic alliance is a central pillar and NATO is an indispensable part of our security. It talks about adequate equipment for the armed forces, which is a political nice way to recognize adequate funding without talking about 2%, which has become a very toxic element in the German debate. It talks about the lessons learned from Afghanistan in order to inform future operations. So there's a lot of good elements in. All the details will be negotiated in the next week. That's why I don't really want to engage in tea leaf analysis on what it's going to be in, what it's not going to be in. I want to be confident that Germany lives up to the responsibility it has had in NATO so far. And the crucial role Germany used to play in NATO was to bring allies from various positions together, trying to bridge the north-south, the east-south, and other things together, those who are tough on Russia, those who are not so tough on Russia. And it served as a military enabler, because many countries in Europe decided to cooperate very closely with Germany in military terms and to closely link their defense planning to Germany. Countries like Hungary, who coordinate their defense planning with Germany. You have countries like the Netherlands, where Germany and the Netherlands decided to actually integrate their land forces together. So Germany has actually turned, into a certain extent, to an enabler for defense in Europe. That comes with big responsibility. That means if Germany is living up to what it promised in EU and NATO, if Germany is spending enough, if Germany has ready armed forces, which is not always the case, German strengths can turn into European strengths. Unfortunately, also the opposite is true. If Germany doesn't fund its military enough, if you don't have ready forces, if you don't live up to our promises in EU and NATO, German weakness quickly turns into European weakness. And this is, if we come back to a full circle to what I said initially, that's why this process of doing a new concept is so important. Because it's about explaining why NATO matters, why defense matters, and why we should engage on this. And this is, I think, the key point what we're doing today, explaining why it matters and why we should commit it to do so also in the future. Merci.
Of time, and I'm glad to see that you're optimistic about events back home. Luis, turning over to you now. Tú vas a hablar en español, ¿verdad? Muy bien. Si miramos.
If we take a look back, what has mattered most since the previous strategic concept was approved was the rise of China. And of course, in the new strategic concept, the NATO has to respond to this new phenomena. However, for us, the Europeans, this comes with a challenge and with a certain danger. It means that the United States will only perceive us as useful allies to the extent that we share their analysis of the growing rivalry between China and United States, and to the extent that we are capable of doing something on this regard. And as we all know, and as Claudia explained very well, NATO is a very heterogeneous organization, and our societies perceives threats in different ways. So could you possibly, when talking about the characteristics of this future strategic concept, focus on this issue. How are we going to manage this dilemma, this dichotomy? Thank you, Charles. Good morning to all the participants and to the rest of the panelists. And this is a key issue. I'm going to try to be brief. I like the way that you pose the question as being taking a risk of being perceived by the United States useful only to the extent that we have their same opinion about China, but it is useful for us to be considered geopolitically useful by the United States. I'm going to try to elaborate on that. It is true, and this has also been mentioned by the Secretary General and by Claudia, is that the challenge of China is a political and geopolitical challenge, not so much, although, I mean, it comes with a certain military aspects, but it is growing the way that we perceive it at the NATO, especially in December 2019 in London, in the summit that we had over there. Ever since, the presence of China in the NATO circles has kept on growing, as we saw this summer in the Brussels summit, where we had many conversations about China, and we are expecting to increase these conversations about China in the strategic concept of Madrid, probably because, as Claudia was saying, we need to codify what NATO was doing in the last years. And it is true that China has entered the NATO dialogue by the hand of the United States. United States is identifying China as the main strategic challenge in the long term for the United States and for the set of alliances, institutions, and standards that come from the U.S. power. That was the diagnosis that was done by Donald Trump, and it is a diagnosis that it is supported by the Biden administration 150%. We've already seen all the references to extreme competition with China and to the fact that China is the only power capable, according to the national security guidelines of Biden, capable of threatening the international order in a sustained way. So I will say that the Biden administration decision of prioritizing China on top of anything else, and that shows the fact that they're leaving Afghanistan as they justified, or the Locust Initiative, Australia, United States, and the whole mess of the submarines is very relevant. They're putting China as a priority on top of everything else. And United States is taking a look at all of the aspects of their foreign actions from the perspective of the strategic rivalry with China. And they are starting to conceive their relationship with the rest of the states and their international position from the perspective of the possible contribution to mitigate the Chinese challenge. That doesn't mean that United States doesn't have other objectives in foreign policy. It's not taking up the whole space of foreign policy, but it is more and more presence on everything that U.S. does. They always have the Chinese perspective, and that includes NATO. United States think, and in my opinion, they're right, that it will be very strange that an alliance in which they are investing so many military and diplomatic resources cannot be useful with regards to their main geostrategic challenge in the long term. So we need to understand that. We really need to understand that. And we totally understand this. NATO is not perceived as useful as part of one of their main partners, the United States. That doesn't mean that Europeans only need to abide by what United States says with regards to China, but they cannot forget about this strategic priority. And more than discussing what the NATO can do with regards to China, but it's a very complicated, multifaceted analysis, I think that we are displacing the gravity center in the geopolitical area towards the Indo-Pacific region, and that's a strategic shock for NATO. It is true that the Euro-Atlantic region will continue being a reference point for NATO, but the future of the alliance is going to be more and more linked to a strategic geodynamic that will exceed the European Atlantic region, in a sense that NATO is not accustomed to, nor is the EU, nor their member states. Ever since NATO was created in 1949, and ever since the Industrial Revolution, the Euro-Atlantic region has been the center of gravity at the geopolitical level, political level, etc. What happened in Europe had a tremendous impact in the balances and geostrategic issues on the other side of the pond. But the traffic, especially with the Indo-Pacific area, it's coming more in the opposite direction, from the Pacific to the European Union. And this is a very deep change that will necessarily change the mentality of NATO, so we have a more global approach. Not necessarily in the sense of having a military presence in Asia. We're not talking about that. In fact, I don't think that's interested, not even for the United States, because they have better allies there that are more adapted to the system, and that's a totally different debate. But in the sense of systematically reflecting on these communicating vessels between the Indo-Pacific theater and the Euro-Atlantic theater. And in that sense, China has many implications in issues like technology, etc., etc. The evolution between the relationship between China and Russia. We need to understand it, and we have to be on the same page that the Americans are, so we are in the same page, and there are not mismatches in the perception that we have in the EU versus the perception that they have in the US. And broadening our scope will lead NATO to think beyond the military aspects or the defense aspects, because China is using non-military methodologies in order to undermine the resilience of the alliance. Especially when talking about values, we see a contrast between autocracy and democracy. Technologies, they can be used on very many different ways from ones and the others. And this is part of the process of a rivalry between two big powers. That's why is very relevant, as the ambassador was saying, to achieve political cohesion and a great transatlantic union. And that's going to be one of the main aspects covered at the Madrid summit. To wrap up, one key challenge for NATO will be to reconcile their primarily military and Euro-Atlantic nature with the fact that there is a reality that it is non-military and non-Euro-Atlantic and will have a more important impact in the structural defense of the Euro-Atlantic region. That's why we need to have more broader dynamics in how these we have to analyze how these broader dynamics will have an impact in the defense, EU-Atlantic defense, and this will be covered by the summit and the strategic concept of Madrid. Thank you. Thank you very much for giving us some conceptual clarity. Today, we have the presence of the Tunisia and Lithuanian ambassadors. That's a beautiful way of visualizing some of the things that we're trying to do here. Federico, thank you very much for joining us here. In an event like today, we needed to hear from the Spanish administration, and we want to hear from you. How do you perceive Madrid summit, which is obviously a milestone both for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Spain as for the whole country? And what is your perception with regards to the for the strategic concept? What aspects should be highlighted? What aspects that are sensitive to Spain will you try to include in the strategic concept? Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to Elcano Institute, first of all, because I think this is a wonderful initiative. Us talking today about the future Madrid summit, I was talking to the Secretary General about some considerations, and I was explaining to her what it meant at that time by mid-1980s and mid-1990s, the social debate that we have here in Spain, full of controversy and a very vivid. We're seeing some reactions already. But I think it was the symptom of wonderful democratic health. It was a controversy, and at the end, it was solved by confirming our commitment with NATO. And that's why it's especially important, and we're very lucky to be able to see each other face to face after so many months of confinement. I think it's especially important that El Instituto Elcano has taken the initiative of opening this debate out of the strict sphere of the administration and institutional bodies, but opening the debate to civil society, that we want at the ministry to be involved in the process of preparation of the summit. We want civil society to be heard. I think that what happened in the 80s, that Spain joined the so-called European communities, was a moment that was crucial for our economic and social prosperity. This prosperity that we've achieved is due to the decisions that we made at that time, and especially our link with the NATO has very much to do with what we are today at a political level, economic level, and at a social level, also at the military level as well, because this meant the starting of a process of modernization of our armed forces, which cannot lose sight of. We have certain priorities, of course. It is not our intention just to be the host, hopefully an excellent host. And I'm sorry, maybe my self-esteem is very high up, but we are hoping to be an excellent host. And all societies probably want to be an excellent host. And thank you very much to Claudia for her thought-provoking intervention. But Spanish society have to increase their self-esteem. I think this summit is going to be a well-organized summit, and it is going to be full of content, and we want to be more than good host. We want to be able to express our concerns. Some of these concerns are shared, and these are shared not only with all the NATO, but with all of the member states. Also, we need to reinforce our commitment in line with the initiative NATO 2030, achieve a better cohesion of the organization, of course, reinforces the concepts of deterrent and strength, our concept of resilience, improve our technological advantages, being aware of what technology represents right now in the world and the challenges that the technological changes are posing to the global order nowadays, challenges in the sense of security and defense, challenges for industrial and economic development, challenges in terms of what we are calling, in the exercise we did in the last months at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the human dimension of technology. There we'll find challenges such as fake news or manipulation of information, the manipulation of electoral processes, data privacy, and it is essential from our perspective to connect these three pillars that I have just mentioned: the economic development, the industrial development, research and development, security and defense, and if you will allow me, the technology with a human factor. We're fully convinced that these topics apart from the ones that we can geographically identify in an easier way with international actors that have already been mentioned in the previous interventions, the intervention of the Assistant Secretary General for Public Democracy, also by Claudia and Ruiz, there are other topics that we'll have to tackle as a club of democracies that we are. Also, we'll have to cover the issue of climate change. And of course, Spain is broadly committed to support all initiatives in the framework of NATO, as well as in the framework of other international fora are considered to tackle this essential and crucial issue, climate change. I think I need to mention that within the EU, we're right now undergoing a reflection moment that doesn't necessarily have to be linked to circumstantial issues, such as, for example, the position of the Trump administration. The issue of a strategic, European strategic autonomy is a concept that it is under construction right now. It's something that we're talking about, and you should not be worried about. Because in my perspective, first, this is a very broad concept. And because of how broad it is, now that we are creating it, it's a very ambiguous concept. When we talk about a strategic autonomy, we're not only talking about the defense of Europe, we're talking about value chains, always respecting the philosophy of openness of the European Union to the world from the economic and social perspective, trying to disseminate our values in politically open. So we have to be, of course, very skillful, very creative, so that the process that was being mentioned by Claudia of the creation of a new strategic concept that will all make us all feel proud, because we know that in the future they will talk about the strategic concept of Madrid, but it has to be done in line with the theoretical process that we have started at the EU, which is this strategic compass. In the strategic compass, we have undoubtedly we consider to be extremely relevant partnerships. Partnership with the UN and partnership with NATO. And that's something that we need to bear in mind. We have to be respectful. Those member states who are part of the EU and the NATO have to be respectful with the decisions of the rest of the member states in both organizations, members of the EU who are not part of the NATO and members of the NATO who are not part of the EU. But we have the desire of seeing this possible partnership between the two processes, respecting the specificities of each one of the organization's characteristics, but we would like to see this double side of Western countries, EU, NATO, without forgetting other international stakeholders that consider themselves as part of the Western world. Minister Alvarez spoke the other day of Latin America as an Euro-compatible state, but I will add Australia, Japan, South Korea, etc., because they also are. And this has already been mentioned by the previous panelist. Spain is going to be working to have the most sophisticated and complete as possible Western presence in this summit, apart from the summit of the member states. They also asked me to talk about partnerships. even if it was very briefly, to talk about what's going on at the south and the role of the NATO in the southern neighborhood. You know what are the priorities, the political priorities of Spain? Of course, we are deeply committed with the process of European process of integration. We are deeply linked with the European and Transatlantic Alliance. But of course, now, and it is the moment for me to talk about our south neighbors. NATO has been working on the so-called MENA region for quite a long time, from Mauritania to the Middle East, including Israel. So we have a tool that it is really complete. Easy, difficult to manage and complicated to manage, but allows us to face one of the greatest challenges that we have. A very restrictive concept of security, or restricted to a limited geographical space, in my opinion, that's a recipe for failure. The security of our democracies, the Euro-Atlantic democracy security, has to do with what's going on in our neighboring and not so neighboring countries. Challenges such as the manipulation of migration flows. Migration per se is not harmful. On the contrary, we think is positive. We don't like talking about illegal immigration. We talk about irregular immigration, but that's one of the challenges. International terrorism is another challenge. All these aspects that I mentioned when talking about technology, hybrid threats have no borders. We cannot limit our concept of security limited to the territorial space of the member states of our organization, and that's the way we need to approach it. I'm not going to be talking about Russia and China. It's already been mentioned by the previous panelist, but I do want to mention how we perceive the possible structure between NATO with what we call the southern neighborhood as a very broad concept, not necessarily what is at the south of the United States or at the south of Europe. We believe that cooperation needs to be a cooperation that is accepted by both parts, not imposed, and we need to take into consideration the sensitivities of our counterparties. And our cooperation needs to be very creative. It has to be tailor-made, depending on what every country or group of countries, because they are getting together in groups, what they request from NATO. And we need to do it in a tailor-made way. It needs to be complementary and consistent with what is done with other organizations. Of course, the UN, running away from the minimum common denominator, that's lethal to achieve results. But taking into consideration the different sensitivities of the different organizations, also working with the EU, let's be consistent and let's work in union with these other bodies, with the EU, with the UN, and also with other regional organizations such as the African Union. Of course, this cooperation needs to be adjusted to our strategic interest. Of course, we have to inquire to our regional partners, and of course, it has to be given the necessary resources. Claudia mentioned it. That's the big battle that we have, the funding and the resources. Funding appropriately the actions that we believe that need to contribute to our security. Spain is very interested, and I'm going to be more specific in this, we're interested in taking into consideration two aspects. Above all, one, but also the other one. that are posing important challenges for our human safety. First of all, the situation at El Sahel region. The NATO already has an access point to G5 Sahel, which is Mauritania, and it needs to be strengthened and it needs to be potentiated. This is a region that it is closer to us than what we tend to think, and it represents a tremendous challenge. We need to achieve a stability over there because there are third parties not necessarily sharing our values, are starting to be interested in the region. And then Guinea's Gulf. Spain has a long tradition of commitment with maritime security. We did it because we were facing national challenges to face in the Indian Ocean some years ago. If I'm not mistaken, this was around 2011, 2010. We were already, it's been already 10 years, but now we see a new aspects related with a maritime safe, like the Guinea Gulf, and we're trying to contribute to the stabilization of these maritime spaces that pose challenges in terms of piracy, and these challenges are truly relevant. So we have to exceed, in order to wrap up, I'm going to say that we need to exceed the geographic limits that we had imposed to ourselves in NATO. NATO is an alliance of democracies, and now we're facing hybrid threats, like the misinformation, the manipulation of electoral processes, data privacy, and these are challenges that are impacting not only Euro-Atlantic partners, but also Asian and Latin American partners, and this needs to be taken into consideration in order to prepare Madrid summit. Madrid summits that's going to happen at the right moment and in a good place, a place that suffered in the past the impact of terrorism, but we responded with tolerance and with balance to that attack. And many years later, we're going to host a very important date like this one for the whole Western world. Thank you very much, Federico. We still have a few minutes for debate. There's a microphone in the room. Maybe the gentleman in the second row, but before giving him the floor,
let's see if I can find it now. Ana Maria Martín, who is president of the Spanish Atlantic Council Association. And by the way, we have about 150 people watching this event live, in addition to those of you who've been kind enough to join us this morning. And Ana Maria wants to know what role you envisage for youth and youth organizations in the Madrid summit. Ambassador.
Thank you very much for this question. Again, when I look at the audience here and when we discuss issues within NATO, we all, of course, are young. We all think we are young and that we will stay that forever. But we also clearly know that there's a new generation coming up that, are there in our universities, in our high schools, and who have graduated. And they will have to take the lead in taking over the NATO, taking over other international organizations, national governments, military, political institutions in our countries. And indeed, for NATO and for all of us, it's extremely important to both listen to them, because the discussions they are having are different from what we are having today, but it's not necessarily about different subjects. It's also about the security, but framed differently, looking for different solutions. So it's important both to listen to them, but also engage them and also challenge them to think about wider issues outside their bubble. So for us, that's why we have clearly identified, we run a very large audience research program at NATO in all 30 allied countries, and we clearly see that the young audiences know the least, not only about NATO itself, but about variety of security and defense challenges when we frame them traditionally. But in the same time, when we reach out, they have a lot of interest actually to discuss and to engage and to think with us. So that's why we have run quite a number of youth engagements, also less traditional for NATO, such as hackathons, policy hackathons, discussions on climate and security, discussions with universities, to actually continue their thinking, but thinking differently. And also for the summit, there will be in the run-up of summit, we will attempt in all 30 countries to create events with our young partners, youth audiences, universities, and beyond. We will support initiatives that are, for example, model NATO. We all know what is model UN, when our high school students, universities are actually testing in practice what it means to be UN ambassador for one particular country. So we are trying, and there are the whole set of successful trials and having that as model NATO. Crisis management or challenges to territorial defense and so on and so forth. So we will continue doing that from NATO, but also we expect allies really reaching out from their institutions, from the governments, and involving our future leaders in today's thinking.
Thank you very much. Let me just add, Ana Maria should feel free, she's following us from Brussels, I understand, to send us an email suggesting what she would like NATO to do in Madrid, and what she would
like to do herself.
Exactly.
To involve youth.
What she would like to contribute to this.
Exactly.
And of course, let us know what she thinks Elcano should do. Por favor, el general.
Buenos días.
¿Se puede presentar, por favor?
Could you please introduce yourself prior to posing your question? My name is Federico Yanis Velasco. I'm a general of the Armed Forces, already retired, and I'm a member of the Atlantic Association and a Spanish representative. First of all, we need to thank Royal Institute Elcano and its chairman and all of the members of the Institute, the fact that they've given us this opportunity of meeting again face-to-face in this wonderful scenario, and to hear these panelists so well prepared and given us very interesting presentation. Above all, thanks to the ambassador, but during the conversations and during the presentation, there was one thing, one reflection that in my opinion is very important, done by Professor Simón. He spoke about the political sphere and the military sphere of the NATO. For lay people, the NATO is a military alliance. It's just a military alliance. And we all know that it goes beyond a military alliance, and that the political aspect, the political arm of it is very relevant. Not only is very relevant, but in fact, we're sacrificing many things because of this political arm of the alliance. But the military part, which is still important and which is still a unique characteristic of this alliance, cannot be neglected. Not only it cannot be neglected, but it has to be tackled together with the political arm. We cannot make decisions that will have an impact in the military arm of the alliance. It's not the moment to give you some details, but maybe Professor Simón could elaborate on this dichotomy between the military arm and the political arm of the alliance. Thank you very much. And before giving the floor to Luis, we're going to take another question. Someone asked for the floor over there. If you could raise your hand again, we'll give you a microphone, because without microphone, we cannot translate the questions. Don't forget to identify yourself prior to asking the question. I'm Juan from the University of Burgos, and I wanted to ask with regards to one of the things that was mentioned here. I'm very clear about the fact that the summit will be very well organized, will be good host, and I'm sure that many strategic concepts will be developed, looking very good in paper, but there are other geostrategic aspects that had to be taken into consideration, certain structural problems. You mentioned the German case before, but the Spanish one is very similar in terms of the relevance that we pay to certain defense aspects. So will it change the organization of this summit, the structural problems that we have on these regards in foreign policy in Spain with regards to the priority that we give to certain defense aspects? At least our political elites never pay attention to that and never give it the relevance that it deserved. When we think about NATO, I mean, it's getting confused among myriad of organizations. I don't know if we've done what we should have done when giving the priority to the defense that it deserves. In fact, defense and foreign affairs are separated in different ministries. So what can you say on that regard? Thank you very much, Juan, for your question. First of all, we'll give Professor Simón the floor so that he can answer about this dichotomy, and afterwards Federico can answer Juan Tobar. Thank you, General, for your question. It is true that both arms are very relevant, and it is very important to achieve a good combination of the military arm and the political arm. The military arm has to be at the service of the political one. The NATO is a collective military tool, but at the service of a community of values, political values. That's what it is. You know that very well. I concentrated on the political arm because they told me that I had to cover the issue of China, which is an aspect that it's being tackled from a broader political perspective, not so much a military one, although we have the technological component that is part of our defense. But obviously, the NATO agenda in the military arm is, as you know, very, very, very dense in the field of deterrence and defense that mentioned both by the ambassador as well as by Claudia and Federico, but also in terms of the modernization of the armed forces, which has been clearly noticeable in our country ever since we joined NATO, but also in terms of reinforcing capacities. When talking about the South neighborhood, this is very important both for NATO as well as for Spain, reinforcing our military capabilities of the different partners, including, in this case, Mauritania. So in order to summarize, this is a topic that it is multifaceted, very broad as to answer in a couple of minutes, but obviously the military component is essential, and the relevance of maintaining the technological military advantages that we're having, the military organization, the command structure, and reinforcing that will play a very important role at a strategic concept of Madrid. I just didn't have time to tackle all that today. Thank you, General, for putting that topic on the table, because it is true that very often we pay a lot of attention to the political narrative and we forget that this is a military alliance. Federico, it is now your turn to answer the question. It was really interesting, and I can understand what's behind it, of course. And of course, this is a reflection that's absolutely necessary. Based on what's happening right now, I could be talking about what has happened in the past, because I've been working on this for the past 36 years, but I want to talk about how we're doing things right now. I think that the recently approved strategy for foreign action, approved by the cabinet in the end of April this year, as well as the national strategy that will be approved very soon, prove exactly the opposite to what you were saying, if you don't mind me being so drastic in the way that I'm expressing myself. In the process of preparation of the two documents that I've mentioned, contacts with all stakeholders of the ecosystem in foreign affairs were very relevant. And of course, the Ministry of Defense played a crucial role. And the other way around, in the still not finished process of preparation of the national security strategy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is broadly involved. You can say that it means nothing. That's not guaranteeing that there is a good correlation between the two of them. But I want to think that we're in the right path and we're doing things correctly. And I will say that the image and the reputation of Spain abroad, and those of us working in this area are very much aware of this, Spanish society gives a great value to the commitment of Spain with the peacekeeping operations, both under the scope of the UN as well as under the scope of the EU, and also as well under the scope of NATO. The effective presence of Spain is highly regarded, and that is important when quantifying how we all contribute to international peace and security. And therefore, you need to take into consideration our presence in these keeping missions. And those are facts, no theories. We're on the field. We're capable of keeping peace. We're capable of maintaining peace or contribute to keep peace. We are capable of training armed forces and law enforcement in whatever country that they requested. Will soon be in Libya in an observation mission, making sure that ceasefire is maintained. So our level of engagement is very, very high. Maybe your analysis is considering that we could be even more present. And some sectors of society perceive safety or security and defense in a different way. Their perception is based on some theories that have been outdated with regards to NATO and the defense dimension of Europe. But we can also challenge the concepts of the UN, where we've been very active. For example, in the improvement of women's rights, supporting women, peace, and security resolution. So we're not standing by and doing nothing. More can be done, but we're in the right track. That's the summary. Okay, we have a special report on women, peace, and security coordinated by Marina Solanas.
Ana María Blázquez, who works for the Spanish news agency, EFE. And she would like to know your opinion as to whether there isn't, although we always like to say that the EU-NATO relationship is friendly, is largely, risk-free and so on, isn't there the danger, she wants to know, that we might actually collide in the next couple of years because we have such different visions? When it comes, for example, she suggests, to responding to what happened in Afghanistan. Would you like to take that?
Honestly, I don't really see the risk.
Mm-hmm.
What I do see in the moment is that most states in EU and NATO are really committed in improving the cooperation because they see the added value that each organization can actually bring in. NATO is the worldwide biggest standing military alliance. I mean, that's a statement. And if you look what NATO can offer to its allies in terms of deterrence, in terms of protection from conventional up to nuclear, this is not something anybody can equal. The European Union has an enormous power when it comes, for example, to question like resilience, question like industrial regulation, stabilization, and then bringing the various number of tools together. Military tools, crisis management, civilian tools, economic tools, trade. So we actually have two organizations that are complementary, and if they succeed in cooperating, that would actually be great. And if you look at the membership, you have, I think, Ruiz, correct me, 21 countries, I think, or Baiba, who are members in both alliances. So one would also say, I mean, if you're a member of EU and NATO, I mean, you should be able to agree. We obviously all know that the elephant in the room is the political cooperation. So we have some countries in NATO who don't have the perfect political relation, like Greece and Turkey, and that doesn't often help in cooperating between EU and NATO. So I think to bring it on a very kind of simple point is, as long as we have political problems among certain countries, we can improve our technical cooperation. Working groups can work together, working level can coordinate, and we have to do that. And we have the chance with the strategic compass in the EU and the strategic compass in NATO to really coordinate that. And the 21 countries who are members in both, that's their homework, to make sure that we coordinate each other. And in the end, it always boils down to what member states want to do it. The organizations, EU and NATO, are as strong as the member states, the allies, make it. So it's up to you. I'm joking. It's up to the countries actually to make it happen. But I don't see a competition because I think in the basis, EU doesn't want to do deterrence and collective defense. No. And NATO doesn't want to do what the EU is doing. So really it's about, we have the luxury of having two organizations, make them cooperate and put your political fights to the side.
We have time for two very short questions. There's a lady at the back.
Oh,
Ramon de Miguel.
you're right.
So please be very brief in your answers, and the panel will try to be very brief. Sorry, the other way around. Brief in your questions, and we will be brief in our answers. Thank you. Can you identify yourself, please?
Good morning, I'm the ambassador of Tunisia.
About a status that probably was not mentioned today, but I didn't hear it anyway. What would be the major non-member allies or allied, as we are, for example, in Tunisia? Is there a reflection on a change within the strategic concept of being a major allied non-member of NATO? That was my question.
Who would like to take that?
So
Yes, Ramon, would you like to add yours? Ramón de Miguel. Adelante, cuando. Tienes el micrófono, perdona, para.
Sí.
After the failure or the failures of the Afghan mission, does the summit at the NATO consider the possibility of establishing new methodologies for the interventions outside of the purely transatlantic scope? Because the one that has been done there, it was a disaster in some cases. And my second question, since we have a partner at NATO that is not being totally faithful or loyal to the alliance, both in their dealings with Russians or in the purchase of weapons, does the NATO summit have the intention of putting things clearly on the table with regards to what's going on in Turkey?
Tomamos, si les parece, la primera pregunta de la embajadora. Muchas gracias, embajadora.
First, we can answer the question of the ambassador, the Tunisian ambassador. Thank you very much for your question.
Would you like to? Yes, please, Ambassador.
I think in all the partnerships, again, when we look at the agenda, when we look at the threats, at the challenges, at, whatever we are faced with as the alliance, but also as democratic societies, it's important to identify actions that we take to counter them. So that's why NATO as a political military alliance has its set of actions. Other organizations will have others. So OECD, you saw, took the decisions with regard to the taxation, the global sort of level, more or less level playing field in that regard. So it depends. It's different arrangement for different sets of challenges. As far as the NATO is concerned, it's important when we look at the challenges that we are faced now, be it kinetic, the hard security challenges, Russia's aggressive behavior, and so on and so forth, but also the other challenges that are so-called hybrid, non-kinetic. It's important to have partners. It's important to have partners in an organized way, but also important to have partners who are not necessarily formally NATO partners, who understand these challenges and who can enhance our responses with their knowledge, with their wisdom, but also taking action domestically. Those are democratic countries, we are all different, we have different arrangements, but in the same time, the security cannot be divided. So it's important what Tunisia does domestically in terms of raising its resilience of society, in sharing its knowledge, in working whatever way it finds proper to work with NATO. So again, we are not setting one-size-fits-all type of recipes for our partnerships, and it depends, as our minister said, it depends on the local sensitivities, it depends on the two-way partnerships. So very clear. The second question, I would like to strongly disagree about calling allies names. We are a family of 30. We are all different. And we are, like in the family, we all know we have people with different views and we have countries with different setups. There is no one perfect democracy. There is no one perfect sort of way to arranging things. With all allies, they talk amongst themselves. We remember in the NAC rooms, there is a very clear sign that says, animus in consulento liber. We discuss open, engaging issues. 30 allies have, as you rightly said, the different perception of threats. They might have, but they come together and they share those perceptions and they actually find consensus and are able to define a common threat assessment. And on that basis, on this exchange of information, intelligence, threats, so on and so forth, to find those actions that are necessary to counter the threats. So, and it is on the basis why the alliance was established. So it's not pro or against one ally. We have to accept the differences, but we also have to find the way ahead. And Turkey and Greece are finding those ways ahead. And the advantage, of course, for NATO is that this is a place where the militaries work together on an everyday basis. And the challenges that we have, again, as political military alliance, we need to address them. It's just simple as that. It's necessities that places us in the best position as a transatlantic, as the strongest transatlantic political military alliance to address those threats.
Federico, para cerrar ya, muy brevemente, por favor, si quiere.
Federico, in order to close now, very briefly, if you would like to add something. No, I think the Assistant Secretary General has done a wonderful job in answering this last question. We have to know that our alliance includes different sensitivities, different priorities. Nowadays, they're all democracies. And there will be elections in all the member states of the NATO sooner or later. And we have to be respectful with their different definition of priorities or the different sensitivities or the different perception of the threats. And I'm not going to give any names, as the Assistant Secretary General said. With regards to Afghanistan, it's obvious that I share the analysis of the ambassador in the sense that, obviously, we have the feeling that something went terribly wrong there. And the first thing that we have to do is to draw the right conclusions. Some things work out okay in terms of fighting terrorism, for example. I'm going to be politically correct in my language. A certain degree of social transformation has taken place in Afghanistan, but institutional modernization is something in which we fail. Afghans haven't taken control on their own destiny. We fail in that, and we have an armed group with which, unfortunately, we cannot work. We cannot acknowledge to a certain extent. But I don't think that everything went wrong there. That's why it's very urgent to start, and I'm aware that NATO has this in mind if they haven't started doing it. I mean, maybe they have already started working on this process of lessons learned. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for their participation, to the panelists for being with us this morning. As I said at the very beginning, we're extremely happy to see again face-to-face, not only in this fora, but in possible future fora. But be attentive, because we will continue on organizing activities from now on. And let's end with a round of applause to our participants. Thank you.